Hey folks, how are you? The new year's finally here, so you want to be able to put some skin in the game somewhere, right? Because you are a bit passionate about your endeavors, you're a bit passionate about the sports you follow, maybe even the teams that you also follow. So why not do so over at the #1 site for betting and trying to be able to earn some cash? Hey, you never know what's going to happen, right? Luck is always a very fickle one when it comes to the world of sports, so why not go to OneWin? That's the one place where you'll be able to enjoy the best offers, the best propositions. So make sure you go through with your promises and we'll see where things end up playing out. One thing I do recommend for you is the crucial match between Torino and Napoli. So make sure you go to OneWin because that is the place for you to be able to go and bet. Bet safely, bet legitimately, bet in a manner that you will be able to have the best propositions, and why not? Maybe win some money in the process. I hope you do, and if you do, don't forget about us little people. Make sure you go to OneWin, where I also am offering you a promo code, OneWin24. You can go there, and of course, each time there's a different promotion. We'll talk about it every single time throughout the year. OneWin24. Remember to register over at OneWin using the link that I have in the description below. Remember a couple of days ago, I think maybe even weeks ago, when I was talking about the Brazilian national team and the issues that they're having? Well, it seems to be getting worse and worse by the day. Let's not talk about the getting worse and worse by the day. Let's talk about how it got to this point, because I saw a post the other day by a very top level journalist over in Brazil, Fernando Diniz, and he was talking about how Dorival Junior is now the new candidate to become the Brazilian national team coach. And where have we gotten to, or where has Brazil gotten to, that maybe one of the most sought after jobs, maybe one of the most sought after, but also the most pressure packed jobs in world football, ends up being one that nobody really wants? Or maybe you start looking at the coaches that might be available and willing and able to jump at it the first time. Maybe they're not the most qualified anymore. There's a term, or there's a word that really says it says a great deal. And I have to break this down into several different pockets, into several different topics, because it ends up being more adequate to analyze a bit more what ends up being this Brazilian national team fiasco. And we'll talk about point #1, which is basically the administration. And Ednaldo Rodrigues ends up being the main culprit in causing something that should have never really been a problem. Or it should have been a different problem, or it should have been a problem that should have been addressed earlier, and it wasn't. And what I mean by that, I'm drinking some Commandeer coffee there. Great stuff. I highly recommend it. No, they're not sponsoring, but definitely have to give them a shout out, so why not? Ednaldo Rodrigues, since the end of the World Cup, when Chichi decides to step down, he wasn't going to renew. He was basically done after 2 World Cups and only getting Brazil to the quarterfinals. He basically ends up going out and saying, hey, by the way, it's going to be a new era. It's going to be a new time because Carlo Ancelotti's coming. What? Carlo Ancelotti's coming. Great. Look. You could say whatever you want. You could say it was fake news, which it ends up being. You could end up saying that the reports weren't true, which they ended up not being. But when the president of the Brazilian Football Confederation comes out and says, hey, we already have a contract, we already have an agreement, we already have something set for Carlo Ancelotti to come after his contract is done with Real Madrid, well, you tend to believe it, don't you? Well, that's exactly what everyone and their mother basically did. Now, every time something happened, well, Fernando Diniz ends up becoming the interim coach, not only was he the interim coach, he was the caretaker coach, waiting for Carlo Ancelotti. David Ancelotti was supposed to be coming, he never arrived. Many were waiting for for Ancelotti's son to come in and start kind of organizing and making sure that everything was in place and every single duck was in its particular row. So when Carleto ends up leaving Real Madrid, he would end up taking over at Brazil and making sure that everything was in place. As soon as Copa America was there, he'd just slide in and everything was going to be a smooth transition. Right? At least that's what we thought. Reginaldo Rodriguez continued saying throughout the summer and the beginning of World Cup qualifiers, no, don't worry. Fernando Diniz will stay as the caretaker coach. He's also going to be coaching Fluminense. And then what happens? Well, he'll leave. Carlo Ancelotti comes in. Now, what ended up kind of setting an alarm off for many was, I'm trying to remember if it was in September or in October, Carlo Ancelotti was asked, hey, so what are you doing after Real Madrid? You're going to Brazil, right? He said, no, I don't have anything with Brazil. That immediately should have been a red flag. And it wasn't, I guess, because people continued hearing Reginaldo Rodriguez saying, no, he's coming. I mean, even the official outlets, the official platforms of the Brazilian Football Confederation ended up saying that Carlo Ancelotti was going to be the new coach of Brazil. You keep on going. Brazil lose to Uruguay. Brazil lose to Colombia. Brazil lose to Argentina. Never happened before. As I mentioned in earlier videos. If you can check them out, you can do so. Yeah, the talk was, well, that's probably Fernando Diniz's last game. Or maybe he'll stay during March for the FIFA international window there. Kind of settles things down. Goodbye. Because Carlo Ancelotti was coming in the summer. Then all of a sudden, Carlo Ancelotti renews with Real Madrid until 2026. What happened? Well, there was never anything. He said, look, yeah, we talked, but nothing ever happened. And then add to that Reginaldo Rodriguez ends up being basically booted from his position by a sporting court in Rio, talking about the irregularities there were during the election back in 2022 that ended up electing Rodriguez to be the head honcho over at the CBF. That ends up being a major issue because that's where the talk then begins that Brazil might not be considered to go and partake in the 2026 World Cup. Now, of course, that's still all up in the air. I don't want to be saying that they are or they aren't because nobody knows. Nobody knows what decisions FIFA will end up taking in terms of that. But still waiting to see what happens with Brazil and seeing what happens with them. And of course, all of those things end up trickling down when it comes to Brazilian football at the national team level. It ends up being this constant fight, this constant friction, inconsistencies, abnormalities, and, well, the struggles that do end up having some sort of impact, some sort of effect on the pitch. It's very rare to see an FA in utter chaos to all of a sudden see that their team ends up righting the ship and they end up winning titles and kind of end up being unaffected. I haven't seen one. Maybe Spain, but Spain was kind of everything with all the effects of that Spain side kind of papered the cracks over all the things that were going on with the then president of the FA. Very rarely do you ever see an FA in utter chaos see their national teams flourish. Because at one point, whatever those decisions that are made in the boardrooms end up affecting teams on the pitch. Every time. So there's that. So what do you do now? Well, the executives of the CBF, an entity that is basically acephalous right now, has no leadership, is basically going rudderless at this point, waiting for the elections to take place to find out who the new president will be. Well, they have to find out who a new coach is going to be. So they start looking at Dorival Junior. So yet again, they're going to go poach another coach from another team. Currently, he, of course, with Sao Paulo. And what's he going to do? What's going to happen there? Of course, if you look at the Brazilian coaches, or the coaches in Brazil, there's very little that can be done with this current crop of coaches because they've been so conditioned in the Brasileirão. You don't see a lot of Brazilian coaches go out and about in Europe anymore. It's basically, you see a lot of Brazilian coaches, maybe they go to the Middle East, but some that are already on their last legs that are looking for one big payday. The ones that I do remember are Luis Felipe Scolari. You do remember Carlos Alberto Parreira. At one point, if I remember, there are a few others that kind of escape my mind right now that end up going more over there. I mean, the last Brazilian coach that I can remember off the top of my head that was in Europe Vanderlei Luxemburgo? Oh, no. Scolari with Chelsea. Scolari with Portugal. And, of course, before that, Vanderlei Luxemburgo. So, in over 25 years, you've had 2 Brazilian coaches being able to go and... I'm not even talking about successful. I'm talking about being. Because Vanderlei Luxemburgo had some success. Luis Felipe Scolari had a great deal of success as well. But outside of that, no one else really did much. Quite the opposite. You saw a lot of Portuguese coaches, Jorge Jesus, Abel Ferreira, amongst many others, start to come over to Brazil and be able to establish some success. There are a good set of Portuguese coaches out and about. There's a lot of talk, and if you start looking at Brazilian coaches, and one that I always kind of tend to go back to is Paulo Cesar Autori, who was extremely successful, winning a Libertadores with Cruzeiro, but then he ended up becoming the coach of the Peruvian national team, was coached twice over Atlético Nacional in Colombia and wasn't successful on either run. So, there's a term that they've said, or there's a term used, ultrapassado, for coaches, or for basically, in Brazilian culture, ultrapassado means basically he's run his course, or it's out of fashion, or it's outdated. Brazilian football ends up being a bit of a footballing anachronism when it comes to how players are in a talent and technical perspective, and the coaches coming in with technical theories that are more for holding on and gripping for your dear life because their lives are at stake, or their coaching lives are at stake week in and week out in Brazilian football. Because, okay, losing is permitted in Brazilian football. Once. Losing might be permitted in Brazilian football. Twice. Losing probably won't be looked at too highly upon 3 times. 4, now you're in the hot seat. 5, you're probably gone. So, when you have that type of pressure, there have been teams, and I'm not talking about this season, I'm talking about basically every season, and people say, well, Sevilla had that happen already this season in the first half of La Liga. Yes, they've had 3 coaching changes, but there's been Brazilian teams that have had 4 or 5 in one season. Because the way Brazilian football is looked at, each and every match is lived and died upon by the coaching staffs, or even by the owners, or even by the investors. And understand that in the previous videos where I've talked about Argentina and the structure they have, Brazil is a bit more privatized. So investors start looking at the owners, and the owners are starting to get wary as far as the coaches, and the coaches start to be a bit more protective, and the coaches look at the players and there's a bit of mistrust, and all they start doing is strategizing to be able to win the next game, not to start another project. It's very few and far between that you see sincerely serious projects that have been established. Palmeiras, first and foremost, that's probably, when it comes to Brazilian football, that's probably the most stable project in Brazilian football. But there had to be winning established in order for Abel Ferreira to be able to continue having his team evolve and continue to allow having the luxury to bring in the Hendricks and bring in the young players that have been able to really flourish and then eventually move on. And seeing Palmeiras become one of the more dominant teams in South American football, getting to the semifinals 4 consecutive years in Libertadores and winning 2 consecutive league titles. There's the standard bearer in terms of South American football in actuality. Then you have Flamengo. I don't know if you can call it a project, but because of the amount of money that they spend and they throw it at different transfers, well, they're obligated to win from that perspective, in addition to their pedigree, in addition to their fan base, in addition to the news cycle that they're involved in Brazil, because most news cycles have Flamengo involved in every single one of them. Red Bull Bragantino is another one that ends up being a very serious project, although the results or the trophies haven't been present. Their place in the table has made them a force to be reckoned with. Like I said, they've been to a final of a Sudamericana before. They haven't won the silverware to say, hey, this is a serious project. But if you look at the work that's been able to emerge in all of this, it can be considered that. Who else? Atlético Mineiro? Well, maybe not. But then you start looking at who's in charge of these teams. Abel Ferreira, of course, being the coach that maybe, if he wanted to, he could become the coach of the Brazilian national team. With Flamengo, it's a bit of a toss-up because they've had so many coaching changes since 2019. I think this is now their 5th or 6th coach that they've gone through in 4.5 years. So there's something there. Red Bull, of course, has been a bit more stable. Atlético Mineiro, well, they haven't. But then there's big investments in Atlético Mineiro. It's not only looking to win their second Libertadores, but it's also building their new stadium, bringing in new sponsors, having the most competitive team possible. So there's a lot of that's involved in what happens with Atlético Mineiro. But despite all that, the coaches that are there, and I'll leave Ferreira aside, I'll leave basically the Portuguese and the Argentine coaches aside. You look at the Brazilian coaches, and it's a constant merry-go-round, because you have a Vanderlei Luxemburgo coming to a club for their 7th or 8th time. You do have a Dorival Junior going back to Sao Paulo for God knows how many times. You see Luis Felipe Scolari returning to X or Y club for a 5th or 6th time. Sometimes you see coaches go and coach the same team twice in the span of the same year. So, amongst all of that, that's one of the biggest problems with Brazilian football from a coaching perspective. It's the inability to establish a project, but it's also an inability to be able to expand and elaborate on a philosophy of football. And when you don't have those opportunities, look, it's like a muscle. If you don't exert it, it's not going to grow. And tactically and philosophically, Brazilian football hasn't had that. That's why Fernando Diniz, and of course, in all this, I forgot Fluminense. In all of this, Fernando Diniz ends up being a different mind, a different voice, a different philosophy of football that ends up becoming so important, especially with Fluminense winning the Libertadores this year. So, again, you end up looking at everything that happens. No, that's not the alarms that are being set off because the Brazilian FA is basically on fire. No. Although the sound effects do end up kind of coming in basically on cue. It ends up being that when you prepare to have to win one game, you prepare for that one game. And then you prepare for that next one game. Without a regard in how am I going to have a philosophy of play. That ends up kind of harming the game of football in Brazil. But the money, the sponsors, the ability and resources to be able to bring in the top players, cracks end up being papered because of that in many cases. Sometimes when you add those numbers, when you add that type of money, when you add that type of disorganization, you bring it into one cocktail, it ends up being a very explosive Molotov. So there's that too. So it can be very successful, but at what cost? And Brazil at the club level has been very successful, but at the cost of the national team, especially when you have players that are mostly playing in Europe, players that kind of haven't been 100% on board, or they haven't been 100% considered, or they haven't been 100% informed, end up going into a situation where things aren't running so smoothly. Or you end up saying, why am I going to go 100% for this coach if I know he's going to be gone? Or at least I believe he's going to be gone. Or I've been told he's going to be gone. A lot of question marks. Now, all of that being said, things like this in Brazil can get fixed if there's a will. And more importantly, for them, they're going to have to find a way.